third speaker is Richard Bell from Keble College, Oxford, where he's a CMRS Career Development Fellow in Renaissance History. Over the last couple of years, Richard's been working on a book project on the history of imprisonment in early modern England, based on his Stanford University PhD thesis, title of which is provisionally entitled Imprisonment in Early Modern England, Politics, Debt and Carceral Societies. And Richard's also published a number of articles in Huntington Library Quarterly, Social History, and most recently in the Journal of British Studies. He's currently developing a new project on everyday experiences of state and political authority, investigating how people across the social spectrum explicitly describe encounters with the state in the years leading up to the English Revolution. And his paper today is entitled Imprisonment, Debt and the Socioeconomic Origins of a Radical Constituency in Revolutionary England. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Tim. So, imprisonment for debt was prominent among the social and legal injustices that animated radicals during the English Revolution. The 1649 Digger pamphlet, More Light Shining in Buckinghamshire, highlighted, between the justices of enclosure and the laws of buying and selling, the plight of the prisoners that perish in prison by merciless creditors and jailers, that they may not be mewed up and starved until they are poisoned there. Earlier, in the large petition in March 1647, the levellers had similarly urged mercy for the multitudes of poor distressed prisoners for debt, who lie still unregarded in a most miserable and woeful condition, the great reproach of this nation. Indeed, the levellers were particularly animated by questions of debt incarceration that lie still unregarded. It goes to show that they've been concerned with this for a while, even as early as 1647. And it featured in the earliest collaborations between John Lilburn, Richard Overton and William Wallen, and persisted through their interventions into the constitutional debates surrounding the agreements of the people between 1647 and 1649. By Henry Brailsford's account, of all the iniquities of the law, the levels reckoned imprisonment for debt far above other wrongs, while Donald Veal suggested that 17th century prison reformers were, for the most part, levellers. Yet little explanation has been given as to why this so animated the levellers. It's often assumed that these ideas emerged from within the leveller movement and were then disseminated to their followers. By this account, levellers concerned with liberty or their own experiences of incarceration seemingly made the injustice of debt incarceration self-evident. Yet this has the relationship the wrong way round. These demands were not generated by the levellers, they incorporated a pre-existing campaign native to England's prisons into their radical programme. Prison reformers, or in many cases we might want to describe them as partial abolitionists, were in fact, for the most part, imprisoned debtors whose political activism was grounded in their material experience of failed credit and incarceration. To be sure, many collaborated with radical movements, and some even became leveller supporters as a result. We can best understand leveller campaigns on this front as a result of a series of connections, conversations and exchanges between London's radicals and its prisoner activists. So I think the focus on how activism that developed out of the material conditions of imprisonment for debt was incorporated into radical movements also helps us to rethink not only how groups like the levellers engaged with pre-existing social and political movements, but also how socioeconomic change shaped political thought and radical activism in this period. And this is a question that I think has been largely neglected since the rejection of Hill's Marxist interpretation of the period, and we're only really beginning to kind of recover now. So prisoners for debt were among the casualties of a series of rapid economic changes that had defined the 16th and early 17th centuries. And so offer an example of how socio-economic disjuncture conditioned political responses, not least popular hostility towards political and legal authority. And so to explore these issues, I first want to provide a bit of socio-economic context surrounding imprisonment for debt, before turning to the prison activism it produced, and then the ways in which that activism intersected with radical politics during the revolution. And in doing so, I'm trying to cover 3 chapters worth of material in 15 minutes, so best give it time. So prior to the 19th century, prisons played only a minor role in formally punishing crime. Instead, they served 2 main purposes: to detain suspected criminals awaiting trial, and to hold debtors imprisoned on civil proceedings. Although debt law had remained mostly unchanged since the 13th century, between 1560 and 1650, a new crisis of credit and debt led to a 30-fold growth in debtor populations in London's central prisons, an expansion roughly mirrored in local counties across England and Wales. These were unprecedented levels of incarceration in English history, and arguably marked, alongside rises in houses of correction, a formative period in which English society began to think of the prison and incarceration as ways of dealing with widespread social problems. This was the result of a period of rapid socioeconomic change and social instability from the 1530s onwards, which included a population boom, rapid inflation and the intensification of production, leading to the commercialisation and expansion of the domestic economy, increased overseas trade and colonial expansion, and growing levels of social stratification. One outcome of these shifts was that due to a shortage of hard currency and the absence of institutional lenders, most economic transactions were taking place on interpersonal credit, which was now extended across increasing distances through larger social networks. And as Craig Mulder has demonstrated, the abstraction of credit from bonds of kinship and community and hardening cultural attitudes towards debt sparked crises of personal credit, including rising levels of defaults, civil litigation, and in turn, imprisonment. And given that almost everyone relied on credit to get by, the threat of imprisonment was socially commonplace. I don't have time to go into exactly why imprisonment was used for this purpose in the period, but one important facet of this is that debt law was partly designed to protect landed estates from dissolution through debt proceedings. And so you couldn't actually seize lands as part of debt proceedings. Instead, you could seize chattels and movable goods, or you could arrest the bodies of debtors as a way to try and coerce them to payment and to punish them for their failure of credit. In practice, however, some landowning debtors chose to pay for the relative comfort of imprison and then to preserve their estates to stop them being broken up. And so there's this kind of growing concern, which was partly based on reality and partly based on kind of social anxieties around credit, but there's this kind of population of gentlemen debtors kind of enjoying a nice time in prison and not paying their creditors. By contrast, those reliant on their own labour or trades for an income were typically driven further into debt and destitution, and this in turn fueled downward social mobility among those with the least material wealth to secure their debts, contributing further to growing inequality. So prisons then were both sites where the negative effects of economic change, social stratification and downward mobility were felt especially acutely, but also they were the drivers of this growing inequality. The result of all of this was to generate, as I've said, unprecedented levels of incarceration, leading to acute problems of overcrowding, claims of extortion and corruption are made against jailers, and the emergence of a large medium to long-term prison population with little hope of release. It was from these pressurised conditions that demands for prison abolition emerged. Following a series of riots, petitions and protests in the Fleet and King's Bench between 1618 and 1621, the prisoners of these two institutions published an argument for the near total abolition of imprisonment for debt in 1622 in a pamphlet entitled Imprisonment of Men's Bodies for Debt. And this drew in particular on the language of the ancient constitution and the fundamental laws of this kingdom, arguing that imprisonment for debt contravened Chapter 29 of Magna Carta, which stated that the body of a free man is not to be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And so they argued that prisoners' rights as freeborn men were being contravened by this process. In place of incarceration, they proposed that debtors' entire estates, including land, should be liable to pay their debts. This became a foundational manifesto for the abolition of debt imprisonment during the 17th century and in fact beyond, and offered a blueprint for radical calls for legal reform. Tellingly, the pamphlet was republished in 1641 on the eve of civil war, and although few changes were made to the text, subtle alterations emphasised the protections of the ancient constitution and fundamental law, and the contractual relationship of sovereign and subject as enshrined in Magna Carta, a language that was now increasingly politically combustible. Indeed, this all took on an overtly political valence. In November 1641, a group of prisoners in the King's Bench was accused of seditious speeches against both the judiciary and the monarchy. A prisoner named Thomas Madrick, incarcerated on and off since around 1634, wished that the king might never return out of Scotland, that wars and blood might never cease in England till all the judges were hanged and all the prisoners set at liberty. So here, incarcerated debtors understood prisons as part of a wider state apparatus of law and control, which had the king at its head and that was fundamentally corrupt from top to bottom. So clearly this wasn't a constituency awaiting political radicalisation by civilian radicals in London. Indeed, this sense of the fundamental injustices of imprisonment for debt and its connection to wider political corruption built momentum both within the prison and in print between 1640 and 1645. Prisons were dens of cruelty, injustice, tyranny and oppression, prisoners argued in one petition, claiming that they suffered under the yoke of tyrannical imprisonment that chiefly served gentlemen jailers, grasping lawyers and landed debtors. Indeed, despite attempts to present a united front of imprisoned debtors in these petitions, they began to counterpose the interests of poor prisoners with those that were protecting their landed estates, calling for a means to ensure that such prisoners as have estates and make their prison their sanctuary to the defrauding of their creditors might be forced to satisfy their creditors out of both their moved goods and their landed estates. This campaign was spearheaded by a King's Bench prisoner named James Rees, who was a merchant who had lost a huge amount of money when following the loss of a number of ships at sea. And it included collaborators, that included Thomas Madrick, the prisoner who had hoped the king might never return out of Scotland. And this campaign presented the oppressions of the jail as part of a corrupt state and wider encroachments on the liberties of free-born Englishmen. And it was through this activity that prison activists found allies among London's radicals. Indeed, London's radicals were aware of these conflicts from an early stage. In fact, the 1641 republication of their pamphlet was printed by George Dexter, who was involved in printing pamphlets by Henry Burton and William Prynne. And John Milburn's Chronic Incarceration, which featured heavily in his polemical works throughout his radical career, helped kind of solidify these links. So he described these in ways that were clearly an attempt to place himself within a longer martyrological tradition that went back to Fox's Book of Martyrs, as has been widely analysed. But I also want to suggest here that he used this to place his sufferings within a context of contemporaneous injustices within the prison system. Incarcerated in the Fleet from late 1637 until 1640 for his involvement in illicitly publishing works by John Bastwick and other Puritan opponents of the Caroline regime and Lord and Church government, he was confined up to the poorer side of the common jail, where he grew increasingly acquainted with the history of prison activism there. In his early printed polemic from this period, Milburn repeatedly associated prisons and prison wardens with the tyranny of the bishops and the king's evil counsellors. He accused his jailers of being combinators with the king's traitorly enemies and hoped that along with Laud they would find justice at Tyburn gallows. Yet in doing so, he also drew on specific and long-term injustices in London's prison system. Crucially, he anticipated that his jailers, instead of facing justice at Tyburn, would instead flee as your predecessor Harris did before you. Here, Milburn referred to Alexander Harris, the warden of the Fleet during the agitation of the 1610s and 1620s that had culminated in the 1622 publication of the first abolitionist pamphlet. By invoking Harris, Milburn actively drew on existing traditions of prison activism associated the tyrannous behaviour of his jailers and their support of the king's evil counsellors with a longer history of carceral corruption and abuse. And this, I think, was an effective rhetorical move that associated ecclesiastical tyranny with grievances about social injustice and the early modern state that had become emblematic of wider socioeconomic insecurity. Lots of people, as I mentioned earlier, were afraid of the fate of imprisonment for death. Quite how he learned of this longer history is unclear, but it's evident that he was embroiled in life on the common side of the Fleet. Cut off from his friends and family, he relied on his former prisoners who surreptitiously supplied him with food and drink and smuggled in supplies from his supporters outside. Milburn also interceded on behalf of the poor prisoners relying on charity at one point. In the process, some became close supporters in prison, such as Robert Ellis, a charity prisoner in the Fleet since at least 1628. And tellingly, Ellis was actually moved from the Fleet to the King's Bench for his support of Milburn, where he quickly became embroiled in a campaign against imprisonment for death there, alongside Rees and Madrick, until the early 1650s. Suggestively, James Rees was also moved to the Fleet in a similar period and overlapped with John Milburn, although I haven't been able to find any evidence that they actually interacted there. But they were both in the common side of the Fleet for at least a couple of years together. So these were the early stages of a connection that persisted throughout the English Revolution, and which arguably proved formative for both prison activists and the levellers. Indeed, the hardcore of the nascent leveller movement continued to keep an eye on prisons as the barometer of tyranny. In 1645, England's Birthright Justified railed against the arbitrary and tyrannical government of the Marshal of the King's Bench prison, scarcely in Stratford to be paralleled, comparing the jailer to Charles I's executed evil counsellor. And this, I think, seems significant, seeing as none of the leveller ringleaders were imprisoned, despite all being imprisoned at numerous points. None of them were ever in the King's Bench, and so they're drawing on something that's going on beyond their immediate experience of incarceration. This pamphlet, which is often considered as a proto-leveller manifesto produced by the early propaganda editors, David Cohen describes it of Milburn, Overton and Wallin, not only launched a scathing attack against all arbitrary government, but also dedicated a lengthy section to corruption of the King's Bench, prison and the injustices of the prison for debt. Likewise, liberty vindicated against slavery was likely a collective effort of this coalition of radicals, and offers some of the most extensive critiques of imprisonment for debt in the period, drawing upon the arguments of their imprisoned allies. It repeated common complaints about fees and conditions, and claimed, as inmates had done since 1622 and then in 1641, that imprisonment for debt was against Magna Carta and common law and the liberties of free-born Englishmen. Liberty vindicated also borrowed language such as the phrase soul destroying prisons, which was particularly evocative, from King's Bench petitions that were most likely authored by James Rees. Indeed, prison conditions and imprisonment for debt were a recurrent feature in the early works of Overton, Wallin and Milburn, suggesting that the campaign for abolition provided an early issue around which the nascent leveller movement coalesced alongside other issues. In the other direction, these works also provided important touchstones for ongoing prison activism. In 1647, a pair of prison petitions directly cited liberty vindicated against slavery, including one signed by Thomas Madrick in around 1646, and Rees continued to cite liberty vindicated against slavery until 1659. In some cases, the levellers even may even have recruited prison activists. Rees was perhaps the preeminent campaigner against imprisonment for debt in this period, and by 1649 he was closely associated with Lilburn. One royalist newsbook even claimed that bounties of £500 and £50 were being offered by supporters of the new Republican regime to poison Lilburn and Rees respectively. And Rees was willing to own this connection, publishing The Leveller's Vindication in September 1649, which made him, continued making arguments against imprisonment for debt, but also made increasingly political and leveller-inflected criticisms of the new Republican state. Radical efforts to amplify prison grievances as part of a wider political agenda thus helped to mobilise this pre-existing constituency of prison activists in new and increasingly radical directions. Once these links had been forged between activists in London's prisons and radicals operating in the city, prisoners' arguments for the abolition of imprisonment for debt became staples of radical demands for legal and social reform. As I described earlier, it was included in the levellers' large petitions of March 1647 and September 1648, and subsequently questions of imprisonment for debt featured in the ongoing debates over political settlement following the Putney debates. The issue was most forcefully addressed in the 1648 New Engagement or Manifesto, which criticised the barbarous course still maintained of imprisoning men for debt, thereby hindering them from the use of their lawful callings, though they have nothing else wherewith to satisfy their creditors or to preserve themselves and their families from starving. Echoing arguments that had developed out of prison since 1622, it again called for the end of all imprisonment except for custody before criminal trial. Likewise, in the levellers' final agreement of the Free People of England, they railed against imprisonment for debt of any nature, it being both unchristian in itself and to no advantage to the creditors, and both a reproach and prejudice to the Commonwealth, while repeating the argument that to prevent any real or personal property being exempt from the payments of debts, implicitly targeting the protections offered to landholders. And this was an increasingly unpopular argument among gentlemen prisoners, and there are examples here of prisoners who have large landed estates petitioning against these kinds of arguments, claiming that it's an affront to their posterity and their status. This argument, which pitched the interests of imprisonment debtors relying on their own labour or trades against those subsistent on rents, had been implicit in the 1622 and 1641 attacks on imprisonment for debt and calls for creditors to be able to move on estates only, and were made explicit as early as 1645 by the King's Bench. Indeed, and to quickly conclude, the campaign against imprisonment for debt had its origins in the social turmoil of the overcrowded prison system, where prisoners made connections between their material condition and the nation's political calamities. Future levellers did not bring political consciousness to the prison, rather they drew on a long-developed campaign against debt and incarceration. It was by this means that prisoners were able to contribute not only to a newly intensified debate about imprisonment and debt law, but by extension the fractious conflict over governance, arbitrary rule and liberty that had consumed mid-century England. As Lilburn perhaps recognised, in prison the question of tyranny and arbitrary rule did not start and end with the king and his councillors. Instead, it extended to jailers, judges and lawyers, the officers of the state and representatives of the law. If the state of London's prison system in the 1640s and 50s was the product of the social and economic dislocations of the preceding century, then these had opened the way to the development of new alliances and constituencies within London.